Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. Joining me today to share the 10 spiritual books that inspired her the most on her life journey is inspirational artist, teacher, lucid nighttime dreamer, and author of the globally loved Wisdom Keepers Oracle deck, Rosy Aronson, whose deepest intention is to provide empowering tools and experiences for people to awaken their inner wisdom keeper, serve with integrity, and bloom into their authentic selves. Rosy Aronson, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It's such a pleasure to be here. And it only took a year.
It only took a year, yes. You have a master's in Expressive Arts Therapy and a doctorate in intuitive listening. That's an interesting one. And the creative arts. And you are known for your very rich, fun, transformative offerings, which include books, courses, art, film, several global outreach projects, and the globally loved Wisdom Keepers Oracle deck. Your art is stunning. So before we start, hold up for me one of your books so that we can see how vivid and beautiful your art is.
Thank you, Sandy. Well, you can actually see behind me is one of the Wisdom Keepers in black and white version. And this is the book probably, or the deck. It's an Oracle deck with 64 Wisdom Keepers that pretty much came from my imagination or potentially channeled, who knows, and their stories are in here. But I've got all kinds of books. I don't know if you want to see any more of them. But
incredibly colorful and attractive. You know, it makes me wonder, somebody with your eye, your vision, your ability with art and your imagination, reading books, is that not a little bit of a, not as exciting for you?
That is such an interesting question. Maybe now. I've been thinking a lot about this juncture of my life that I feel more called into the nonlinear artistic realms. Maybe as I'm getting older, maybe as my brain has become so cluttered. But I am also a thinker. I wouldn't say I'm a high intellectual, but I definitely am very philosophical and psychologically oriented. So I've always been very into books.
As you're reading books, do you actually create art in your mind to go along with them?
Oh, that's an interesting. Well, in a way, I would say we probably all do that.
Yeah.
We all do that. Like, that's the beautiful thing about books, which in some ways is a lost art because it allows us to use our own imagination to fill in the holes, especially novels and fantasy novels, but even nonfiction books. I think it activates the imagination. And that's why now, everything is just created for us.
Yeah, but when I visualize characters, I'm visualizing ordinary characters. You are visualizing these amazing beings.
Yeah. And I don't even know, is it a visual? It's a feeling. I get an intuition and then I just start doing something. And then often the face will emerge from what I'm doing, or the image. This is actually really unusual, the Wisdom Keepers. It's an unusual artistic process for me because it's so detailed. Mm-hmm. Usually, when I was in my big painting phase, big paintings and splatter and very abstract and figures and a very fluid, nonlinear process. So this was a very interesting, very meditative, disciplined, just calling it in and seeing what came out process.
Given your imagination, your creative ability, your vision, we shouldn't be surprised at the fact that your first book is Creative Visualization by Shakti Gawain, which was published in 1978.
That's true. That's so funny that you say that. I didn't even think about it at that time. So I know we're gonna hone in just a few minutes per book. So I'm going to do my best, Sandy. So you ready for me to dive into creative
Tell us about
visualization?
this particular book, how and when it came into your life, what you were
Okay,
doing, and
very
the
good.
impact.
Very good. Okay, so I probably read it in 1987 when I was about 20 years old. And at the time, I was a student of the University of Michigan. And I was already drawn to alternative areas of study, transpersonal psychology, social change, theater of the oppressed, women's studies, African studies. But I was definitely going down a mainstream path in terms of my schooling. You know, I'd get the undergrad, then I'd get the grad, and then I'd have some kind of profession. So this was in my junior year, and I was an exchange student in Sevilla, Spain. And in the craziest way, I met this Danish anarchist visionary artist named Hannibal Moon.
Great name.
Yeah, not named after Hannibal the cannibal, but there was like an anarchistic mouse that was his ideal that he wanted to name himself after. It was a totally karmic relationship, love at first sight, completely changed my life. And of course, he was the one who gave me this book. He was the one who introduced me to kind of the whole alternative new age scene inside of Copenhagen. And so this book, I mean, I imagine it's a classic, and many of the people who are listening now recognize it. But it's about, the power of positive thinking, basically. It's really teaching us that anything is possible, and that when we change our minds, we can change our lives. And so as a young woman at that time, I had a very relentless inner critic. Not that that inner critic still isn't present, it is, but it was worse back then. And it was a really empowering message for me. And he really, Hannibal in that book kind of like are intersected for me. He showed me what it was like to live in the light. And he also showed me what can happen when you spend your whole life avoiding the dark. But that's a whole other story that I think unfolds in the books to come. So how was that
No,
for?
that was a beautiful, absolutely nice and concise, and
Okay.
yet very intriguing at the same time. Okay, so book number 2 is Be Here Now. Actually, 2 books, and Still Here by Ram Dass, published 1971 and 2000 respectively.
Yes. Well, again, Ram Dass, I'm sure, is very recognizable to most of your audience. And these are just a couple of the many books that I enjoyed from Ram Dass. And I was immediately drawn to his approach or way of holding spirituality, his humor, his relatability, his humanness. And he came into my life when I really needed to learn how to make peace with what was actually happening and to find some meaning in suffering, which I think is, Ram Dass's major gift. Because at that time, Hannibal Moon, after we were together for a few years, he took off into the light with an underwear model in a very sudden and shocking way. So boy, I really needed Ram Dass medicine at that time, and the permission to look at and accept and embrace the shadow, all of my feelings, and some of the non-new age aspects of myself that were actually getting played out in my relationship with Hannibal, who was running so quickly far away from those parts of him that he couldn't really embrace. So like some of my favorite Ram Dass messages is like, if you want to become enlightened, spend a couple weeks with your parents.
Ain't that the truth?
I think many of us know, or family members or people
Yeah.
who are difficult for us. I remember he used to put like his nemesis, a picture of his nemesis on his prayer meditation altar. And I really took a lot of inspiration from that. And I remember listening to him speak I don't know, I don't even remember. It was some audio or something. And there was a woman in the audience who said, I'm considering leaving my husband. I'm not very happy in my marriage. Should I leave my marriage? Should I stay in my marriage? And he said, you leave your marriage, you learn something. You stay in your marriage, you learn something. And I think that kind of non-attachment with compassion was what I loved so much about Ram Dass. And I also, how am I doing? Do I have a couple more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so like I did my first solo spiritual journey right after Hannibal left me for the underwear model, and I went to the Swiss Alps for a Ram Dass and Jai Uttal retreat in probably it was 91, I think, and it was one of the most beautiful adventures of my life. I mean, I was just like weeping from the sheer beauty and being surrounded by such amazing people. And it's kind of interesting that right now it's kind of like full circle because I am just coming out of a 30-year marriage and kind of opening up to this next chapter. And so I feel the presence of these books and all that they meant for me right at this juncture. So I thought I would just share that with you.
You also have to tell us that you got to sit next to Ram Dass
I did.
on the train.
I did. I sat next to him and Jai Uttal on the way back from the Swiss Alps to the airport. So it was a nice long train ride, and I just got to listen to their conversation, and I was so shy, and I was such a fangirl. It was very embarrassing, but they were very sweet, and I even got a kiss from Ram Dass in the airport and a big hug, and I will always cherish that.
Yeah, definitely something to be cherished.
Yeah.
Book number 3, Grace and Grit by Ken and Treya Killam Wilbur, published in 2001.
Yeah, this book really impacted me for so many different reasons. And like you said, it was co-authored by Ken Wilber, who, again, I'm sure many people know, but just in case, is an integral theorist and a transpersonal psychologist, and his beloved wife, Treya, at the time. And this book was so interesting because it was part theory and part personal journal. And it was actually a real life account of a 5-year-long healing journey of a couple, Ken and Treya, who were facing a cancer diagnosis. And they were both very spiritually oriented. I probably read it in the early 2000s. And at that time, I was studying expressive arts therapy at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, and drama therapy too. And I just want to give a little background to why this book probably hit me so deeply. And maybe not yet. Okay, so like I had spent 8 years in Denmark, many of those years without Hannibal Moon. I ended up staying there. And it had kind of different phases that time of my life. So in the beginning, it was my Hannibal phase where we were making visual art. It was a total new age deep dive, primal screaming, you name it. We were doing it. Love, everything love and light. And then I ended up through all of my explorations discovering water rebirthing. And I became trained in that, and I had a private practice, and I co-founded the Center for Water Rebirthing there, which was very profound work, where very deep feelings and traumas were allowed, right, since we were working with healing birth traumas. So it was definitely progress from my Hannibal phase, but there was still this focus on holding the highest vision, and it was about healing separation, but there weren't such good boundaries, right? So there's a whole story that I could tell there another time, but like so many people in spiritual communities, there were some boundary violations there. And then I went to the Institute for Expressive Arts Therapy in Denmark, which is a Jungian-based education. So I started to integrate much deeper understanding of the shadow into my processes and work with others. That's when I started writing, or when I wrote the first edition of one of my books, Walking a Fine Line, How to Be a Professional Wisdom Keeper in the Healing Arts, where I'm kind of looking at the shadow of both mainstream and alternative training worlds. And also I realized when I was like just thinking about these books, thanks to your invitation, that I also started writing a fictional story, more like a myth, The Tale of Serendipity, which is also focusing on some of the same themes, but from a mythical perspective in animals. Anyway, so it was during that time that I was really focused on finding a more grounded, integral approach to the therapeutic arts and integrating my studies from Ann Arbor, Michigan in psychology with some of this new age stuff that I'd been doing. So, all right, so I come back to the States. I moved back to Chicago where I grew up. Nothing that I studied or did in Denmark counted. So, and I didn't have my tribe or my community. So I really went through a dark night of the soul. I felt really lost. I went to a Jungian therapist in Chicago, which eventually led me to the California Institute of Integral Studies. And that's where I read Grace and Grit. So that was a big like roundabout, but that's where Grace and Grit came to me. And it was one of many books that I read, of course, because I was in school, but it captured so much of what my own journey had led me to understand. And I think that's why it had such a big impact on me, both because of the really moving story and also because it reflected back to me some of my own story, which I'd felt so alone with. And I felt really encouraged to keep doing what I was doing, which was to uncover and explore and out, some of the most common New Age shadows, but also the gifts. And it's something that I still remain committed to, kind of rescuing babies from alternative and mainstream bathwaters. And I actually met Ken Wilber just last year when I was in Colorado with Richard Rudd and Tanmayo Lawson. We stopped by his place on the way to the airport. And it was so again, fangirl moment. it was amazing to be in his presence. And I really want to acknowledge him for being a good listener, because he was really he's someone who could just like pontificate and, and he was curious. So he still has a very inquiring mind. And that was really wonderful for me to witness. So.
Well, book number 4 is one of my personal favourites, The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, 1982. And everybody I know who resonates with that book is absolutely convinced it is not fiction. It was channeled material. Mm-hmm. What's your view?
Oh, I would not be surprised at all.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised at all. Oh, I didn't know that, Sandy. That's really nice. Oh my God, that book, it really, really got to me. I felt like very pivotal in my whole worldview. And I think I probably read it before I went to Denmark. So it was probably in my late teens or very early 20s when I was getting my undergraduate in Ann Arbor. And, again, a lot of these are classics, but I'll just say, this is an epic fantasy novel, the kind of book that I wish that I read more these days. And it's a retelling of the legend of King Arthur and the Round Table, but from the perspectives of the female characters, who in this book they're magical, they're complicated, they're powerful, like Morgane and Guinevere. And they're not just kind of simplified or idealized or demonized as they often are in these historical or legendary tellings. So one thing that the book did that I loved, in addition to what you're talking about, was really just open me up to the true history.
Yeah.
But it really was bringing kind of feminism and myth together. And at that time, I was already doing a real deep dive into women's studies and transpersonal psychology. So it was such a visceral fit with some of the integrating I was doing at the time. And it symbolized this shift in my way of reading and perceiving all of his story, right?
Yes.
And so it's also an example of the kind of book that I've enjoyed throughout my life, mystical, mythical, imaginal, and providing an alternative view on what could be considered a traditional story or historical event or legend or person, even the Mary Magdalene, or all the things coming out in relation to Jesus's story, the grandmother, what was really going on there, and getting that view from the women. So, yeah.
What really impacted me, that book, was, the relationship with nature that we have forgotten. And she writes about people who, the little people, who kind of hide, and people who are not quite human, more sort of some kind of almost extra celestial kind of beings who other energy forms, but the deep relationship they had with nature, and the oneness with nature, and how when before the king could be crowned, he had to go through an initiation with the Green Man. He had to be married to the land itself, because that's what he was caretaking. I mean, that's something, we don't hear enough about.
That's so true. And thank you for reminding me of this, because, a lot of these books that I'm choosing are from a really long time ago. So I don't remember all the details. But when you say that, I'm like, yes, I totally remember that. And I was so touched by that. And I can see the through thread in my life. And even what I'm doing now is so connected to that.
I have a little personal story I'll share related to that book. I am not an artist. I cannot draw, in perspective or anything. And I was reading that book back in, I think it was in the 80s. And my son, who was good at art, wanted to paint something on his bedroom wall. And he was into fantasy, but he was having difficulty. And I couldn't understand why he was having difficulty. He had this great big canvas to work on.
Yeah.
And so at one point, I just said to him, look, just, pick up a book. And I happened to pick up that one. I said, and just start. And for the only time in my life, I drew something that was completely in perspective. And it was the cover of that book, the woman on the horse. And that stayed, he said, it's perfect, leave it. I'm not going to paint over that. But I'd never understood how I was able to do that with that book when I couldn't do it with anything else.
I got goosebumps when you told me that
Interesting.
story.
Yeah.
Have you had more thoughts about it since?
No. In fact, I hadn't even thought about it until you brought it up now.
Wow.
But just thinking about the magic of that book and how many people have said to me, oh my God, that's not fiction. I know that. I know that story deep in my cells.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe you were there.
Well,
and maybe you were an artist back then. Who knows? You might have been tapping into something.
Yeah.
A memory.
Yeah.
Wow.
Who knows?
Sandy, that's really powerful.
Mm.
And I just want to say you're extremely artistic, and there are a million ways to be artistic.
Yes.
Right. So let's not remember, I'm first expressive arts therapist, and then I like to use art, but we all have a creative part of us.
We do. Yes, we do.
So
and we all need to remember that.
We do. Visual art is just one little piece of it. It's just one little. But wow, what a story.
So book number 5, a book that you say really opened up your worldview, The Awakening Earth, The Global Brain by Peter Russell, published in 1983.
Yes. And I think it was around the same time that I read it, in my early 20s. Again, it's hard to even remember at this point, but this book kind of bridges spirituality and science and society in a way that did open me up. And there are just a few essential concepts that I can share right now that people might, resonate with, because I think it's still extremely relevant. One is that the earth is a living, integrated, and self-regulating organism, like a planetary being that is learning, growing, and moving through its own evolutionary trajectory, to be stewarded, as in the midst of Avalon, and to be connected to.
Yes.
And we humans can play one or two roles. We can, together with our totally toxic cities and congested cities, we can become like out of control cancer cells that ultimately and unconsciously consume the planet, which will likely result in our demise, not the planet's, because the earth is pretty sturdy and resilient. Or we can become consciousness seeking and heart-opening cells in the neocortex of the evolving brain, enabling Earth to become self-aware through us. I just love that whole concept, that we're like the neocortex of the brain. And I remember in the book, he would like juxtapose images of like what a city looks like from far away, with all of the like the neurons and the little clumpy stuff, and then what a cancer growth looks like inside the body. And he would put them next to each other, and you could see that. And then, the main point is that we stand at this threshold of a major leap in spiritual evolution. And again, I read this, 35 years ago, and it totally still applies. Yes. And it's up to each of us to do our part in turning a global crisis into a transformative opportunity to honor and awaken and connect with and liberate Gaia herself, and remember that we are Gaia. We're not separate from. It is what we are. We are nature.
Yeah.
And so when we can really join forces, our inner work can have a massive impact on our outer world. And so that's what I think of when I think of that book.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up because, as you say, it really is so relevant today. I mean, he was writing in, 83 that we stand at the threshold of this major leap, and here we are experiencing it right now.
And boy, are we experiencing it right now.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to a No BS Spiritual Book Club interview and sharing the 10 books that had the biggest influence on her life journey to becoming an inspirational artist, teacher, author, and co-creator of the Gene Keys Dream Arc program, Rosy Aronson. And we'll be back with more of Rosy's book 10 best list of spiritual books after this break.
Times TV.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of Times flagship radio show, What Is Going On? And as an author, editor, and 13 times book judge who's read thousands of books and interviewed hundreds of authors, I'm constantly asked what's really worth reading and what's not. So I created the No BS Spiritual Book Club to help you save time and money by picking the brains of discerning names who've walked this path before you. There's no catch, no fees, and no BS. Just an ever-growing library of 10 best spiritual book lists from some of your favourite authors and teachers, plus free book excerpts, audios and video interviews with people like Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., David G., Lee Harris, Mark Nepo and more. From well-known classics to hidden gems you've never heard of, it's the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to enlighten your journey of self-discovery. So why not join the club? Get inspired and save money at the nobsspiritualbookclub.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the Gene Keys in a really powerful way. Gene Keys is basically the code book of life. In the Gene Keys, the book is made up of these 3 levels: shadows, gifts, and cities. And the journey is through those 3 levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the city. And the cities are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back, Rosy Aronson, book number 6, Always Coming Home by Ursula Le Guin, published in 1985.
Oh my God, I totally love that book. And again, memory is a little fuzzy, so I've taken a few notes just to remind myself. This was a multifaceted book, and it was a science fictional story set in a post-apocalyptic world, which explores the same essential themes, which is kind of interesting, that were presented in the global brain, a little bit of Mists of Avalon in a way. So it's kind of interesting to see that golden thread that weaves itself through our favorite book list, and which is really our life's journey in some ways. But in this case, we're dealing with something that's kind of part anthropological textbook, part like compilation of mini novels, personal accounts, maps, dictionaries, songs, myths, legends, and some of those legends carrying Native American themes and folklore. And again, it had strong, nuanced, complex female characters, which meant a lot to me. It always does. And basically, if I'm going to give like a summary, there's like two societies living in juxtaposition. We've got the Condor, or city people, and we have the Kesh. And the Condor is kind of like the incarnation of toxic masculinity. It's like militaristic, it's patriarchal, it's expansionist, it's warriors. Nature is something to be dominated. It's something we're separate from. The feminine is oppressed. The creative arts are even forbidden to women. And then we've got the Kesh, which is this kind of, it's made up of like small, loosely organized communities. The people live off the land in deep connection with the earth, right? Which is what you were talking about in relation to the Mists of Avalon. And so it was about villages. It wasn't about cities, and there was no need for elites, no hierarchy, no war or secrets. It was a peace-loving people. And then what I really loved, that there were different takes on what constitutes illness in each of these cultures. I thought that was really interesting. So like in the Condor world, if a woman expresses some restlessness or a sense of powerlessness, she's considered sick in the society. And the way she gets cured is by being offered in marriage to a man. And the Kesh really thought people were mentally unwell or strange if they tried to dominate nature. They just did not get that, or if they rejected the supernatural. And the protagonist of the story's name was Stonetelling. And she was a really beautiful character because inside of her there was this shadow integration and this synthesis taking place, because she had a father from the Condor and a Kesh mother. And her journey, for me, kind of reflected the human struggle that many of us have to like discover and accept and ultimately integrate all of our parts, like all of the aspects of who we are, and often those are opposing. And like one thing I loved about that book was the relationship to names, especially in the Kesh culture, that as they moved through their life and they moved through rites of passages or went through transformations, they would receive a new name. So at the end of her journey, her heroic journey, Stonetelling becomes Woman Coming Home. I just love that so much. And I've often like asked myself, like now, like even now, for example, like this is a really good time in my life to be asking myself, is there a new name calling me in? And even if I don't make it official, like intrinsically, what's my new name? So I guess I invite people who are listening too to think about that as well. What phase of life are you in? And have you just completed a chapter? And what was your previous name on a mythical level? And what might be the new name that's calling you?
It's very interesting. Yeah, I really like that. Yeah. So are we going to go on a little bit more quickly, because I do want to talk about your work. Book 7, Many Lives, Many Masters, Brian Weiss, comes up again and again, published in 1988. That was a game changer for many of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just one of many books like that I've read over the years that just opened my mind to life beyond the veil. There's so much more to life than what we can perceive through our 5 senses, which is what you were saying about Mist of Avalon as well. I keep bringing that back in. So this is a total classic, as you say, and it's a story about a very highly respected traditional logical psychiatrist who stumbles upon the reality of reincarnation while he's working with a patient who's suffering from night terrors and anxiety. And he ends up kind of following her down the rabbit hole of her subconscious through hypnosis. And over time, not just her past, but her past life traumas are revealed. And not only that, but well, first of all, that process actually helped to relieve the suffering that she experienced. But she also started to access information that nobody else could have possibly accessed about his life and
Yes.
about the son that he had who passed away, who he had not fully grieved. And it was just, so he went through this process of realizing that there's so much more to life than he ever knew, and it totally changed the trajectory of his entire life. And I've read lots of those kinds of books in my life, past life, near-death experiences, in-between lives, ufology, extraterrestrial, ancient archaeology, altered states of consciousness, shamanic journeys, and they all impacted me in a similar way that he was impacted by his client, and that they really opened my mind to the seen and unseen worlds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was that quick enough?
So book number 8, this is a book that spoke directly to your inner child.
Yeah.
The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, published in 1992.
Oh, yeah. I think I read it the year it was released. And at the time, I was a student at the first Expressive Arts Therapy Institute I studied in, which was in Denmark. So I was so primed for what it was all about. And it was just like this huge invitation to get to know and liberate one's inner child. And for me, it really coaxed out that shy and self-deprecating inner artist out of the closet. And it's so practical and playful and deep. There's all kinds of exercises in it, activities, investigative prompts. The two most famous ones are the daily practice of morning pages, where you do stream of consciousness writing. You just empty yourself out, very permission giving, and you warm up for the creative process. And then there's the weekly artist date, which I invite everybody, whether you've read this book or not, to take yourself on. So you can feed the creative soul inside of you and connect with the inner child. And, again, it's one of the many kind of free your creativity books that I read over many years, but this one had a huge impact on me, and I ended up teaching it. I kind of created a combination class between the Artist Way and Jungian archetypes and the expressive arts when I was in Denmark, which people absolutely loved. It was really wonderful. And I actually think Julia Cameron lives here in New Mexico, so I'm hoping I'll bump into her one day.
I've interviewed her, and I treasured the experience.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. I got to find that interview.
It's an old one, but yeah.
It's probably up online, though, right? I can find it?
Somewhere. Okay. I'll see if I can dig it out for you. It was quite a few years ago.
Okay.
So book number 9 is The Dew in the Lotus by Roger Kamenetz, published in 1994.
Yeah. Okay. So I probably read this around 2005, 2006, at a time when my husband and I made the extremely unexpected choice to enroll our daughter at a Jewish preschool. Not just Jewish, but modern Orthodox, which I would have never looked for or wanted. It happened very, accidentally. It was very surprising because I had been walking, as you can hear, like a very rainbow, spiritual, eclectic path ever since I can remember. I never really resonated with organized religion, although I certainly appreciated many of the humanistic aspects of my culturally Jewish upbringing. And I know that my mother, she really is deeply fed by these customs and traditions. So I have a lot of respect for it, but most of my spiritually opening, ecstatic experiences were not in a synagogue. We can just say that. Let's put it that way. But anyway, the feeling of love in that preschool just catalyzed this awakening in me and this hunger to learn more about the roots and fruits of Jewish spirituality. And so I really went back on a deep dive into any kind of mystical Jewish renewal writings that I could do. And I'll just move on to what the book is about, because it's a historic dialogue between a group of Jewish rabbis and Tibetan lineage holders. And so a group of rabbis got together with the Dalai Lama in order to learn from each other and better understand how often violently marginalized esoteric traditions and peoples have managed to survive in the diaspora. And through the book, I realized how beautifully those two spiritual approaches complemented each other, not just out in the world, but in myself. And it helped me understand why I've always been drawn to Eastern teachers with Jewish roots, like Ram Dass, for example. So I did a whole deep dive there, and it really helped me heal my ambivalent relationship to my own roots and find a way to pass along the beautiful aspects of the mystical traditions to my daughter.
Great lesson for many religious groups. That's something they all should be doing, is finding the commonalities between them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a great book.
Okay, book number 10, and I guess we shouldn't be surprised by this one. It's not just a book, you say, but an evolving and universal body of wisdom.
Yes.
A living transmission. And it is The Gene Keys by Richard Rudd, which was published in 2009. And, deeply, deeply impactful body of work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I just want to give a shout out to Richard, who is now a colleague of mine and a dear friend. So I've come a long way from the time I first learned about him and today. I first encountered his work in 2005 at a time when I was a really avid student, soon to be teacher of human design, which is a very fascinating practical system that kind of takes the art of decision making and turns it into a spiritual practice. That's like a shortcut version of it, and also a really big synthesis in its own right. And Richard was a writer. He was a teacher of human design. So that's how I met him first. I met him through his writings about human design, and I always loved his compassionate, poetic, and archetypal approach to it. But the Gene Keys, which was inspired by a deeply mystical experience that he had, and he shared a lot about it online. I'm sure people can find it if they're interested. It really allowed his brilliance to just fully unfold into this even more poetic, mystical, and practically empowering synthesis that includes philosophy and psychology and sociology and culture and poetry and science and mysticism, even the ecstatics. And so given my own tendency to be a synthesizer, I just felt an immediate resonance. And so I got the book when it first came out in 2009. And, you already started to describe what the Gene Keys are. I always have, even though I work with the Gene Keys on a daily basis, I never really know how to say what it is. So yes, it's an evolving universal body of wisdom. It's a living transmission that's held and stewarded and creatively co-birthed and refined by a rapidly growing, group of people or global community that resonate with and work with it on so many levels. You could say it's also developed into an evolving in-person and online retreat center and education with many different streams inside of it, whether it's about practicing the art of contemplation, which I just saw there was a commercial about that Richard was talking about, or discovering and living out one's life purpose, or having healthier intimate relationships, or experiencing true prosperity, or the part that I'm involved in myself, which has to do with connecting deeply with nature and one's intuition and creativity and the dream time. So the Gene Keys is so many things, but it is not a cult, right? There's no way to do it one way. There's no one way to do the Gene Keys. I just want to put that out there. And it's inspired by, amongst many other things, the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, the 64 codons of our human DNA, and the teachings of Carl Jung. And maybe because I already was so steeped in transpersonal psychology and shadow work, I was really drawn to the way that Richard brought in the shadow to this spiritual synthesis. And so you could say that each of the 64 archetypes could be looked at or expressed from a shadow place, a place of fear, or a gift place, a place when we're coming from service, or a siddhi, which is a Sanskrit word for kind of a divine state of oneness that you were also talking about, Sandy, before. So, and it's not like it's, like in these little boxes where they're all happening at the same time, but it's a nice structure to help us understand that when we pay attention to where we're coming from, we can express ourselves in very different ways. So like if I would look at a human design body graph, I could see what that graph would look like if someone was full of fear and coming from a reactive or repressive place, or what it would look like if they were taking all those capacities and channeling it through their desire to be of service in this world, for example. And I could keep going, but should I maybe stop now? Or
Yeah, let's stop now. But I want to talk about your work with the dream arc, because that is, part of the gene keys in a sense, but it is completely different, totally immersive, extraordinary gathering of some of these amazing elders, indigenous peoples, stories. It's something that you could really lose yourself in.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like going down a rabbit hole.
It's many, many rabbit holes.
Yeah.
But the guiding light is the intuition.
Yes, because you get to choose. It's like those choose your own adventure books that came out years ago for the kids. You get to, well, do I want to go to that one? And that's going to lead me down a completely different path, and or like a maze.
Exactly.
But what I want to know is, how did this come into being? Whose idea was it?
Okay, well, that's interesting. Well, okay, so Richard, he has these 64 archetypes, and then he plays with them by pouring them through different channels. One of the channels is the animal kingdom or queendom. And so he created an animal codex where he looked at each of the 64 archetypes in relation to a more shamanic approach, which is underworld creatures, middle world creatures who are the mammals, and then the upper world creatures who are the birds. And so before I entered the picture, he had already started working on this codex of looking at the archetypes through the spirit of animals and the symbolism of them. Okay. And then, he, I guess, got an intuition. This was probably in 2015 when I was attending some big Gene Keys event in Findhorn. I think we were in Findhorn in Scotland at the time. And he pulled me aside and he said, "Hey, Rosy," because I think at that point I had already created the Wisdom Keepers Oracle deck. And I had been involved in the Gene Keys for quite some time. And so he maybe kind of heard about me, and I was, whatever. And so he said, "Would you partner with me around the dream arc?" And at first, I think he was thinking I would just illustrate it. I would illustrate the animals and it would be a book. And I don't think he knew me enough to understand what he was asking when he asked to partner with me, because I had a very strong feeling that the dream arc was going to be, if I were to get involved, very different from the golden path, which is some of what I was describing earlier in layperson's terms. That for me, it was a village enterprise, right? Because when we really work with dreams, we're entering the collective sphere. Nature, animals, this belongs to all of us. And the wisdom keepers from all the different indigenous cultures carry some knowledge that we've forgotten, that many of us in Western civilization have forgotten. We all are indigenous, ultimately. Yes. It's not like, so it's not that I think only, and there's shadow everywhere. It's not like in the indigenous communities, they don't have their own shadows, but they have been carrying, a lot of them, and keeping alive a very deep practice that connects them to the natural world. So I think together, and also with other people, Sally Middleton got very involved, Elijah Parker got very involved. We created a world for people to enter where they could experience the Gene Keys without numbers, without lines, without systems, without profiles, but through their own synchronistic encounters in their life, and then also inside this online course, which, like you say, is full of symbols, full of right brain invitations to get offline. That's kind of what's interesting about it. It's like an online course that invites people to get offline, to go to water, to go to a hike, to speak to a wise person, to have a meal with your friends. There's many different little buttons you click on and you get invitations to hone your intuition, to expand your imagination, to work with your dreams, and to learn from the world around you, basically. And I was just listening to a podcast by a man whose last name I'm blanking on right now, but he wrote Sand Talk. And his first name is Tyson. And maybe people who are listening can look this up. But it was a very interesting interview. And he said, really, all of the wisdom keeping traditions are trying to teach people two things. And I think this resonates with the dream arc. One is how to deal with change, how to navigate change. And the other, he used a swear word, so I won't use that. But he said the other is how to deal with, let's just say, not very nice people or people that you don't necessarily share a worldview with.
Yeah.
And for me, that I think he just captured the essence of the dream arc. We are moving through a huge time of change. And all the old structures, all the old systems that we've relied on are not going to get us where we need to go. So this is like a place where people can work out their muscles, their intuition muscles, and learn to be much more connected to the actual physical world, as there's this counter pull into the technology space, into like artificial intelligence and computers and screens, to keep us connected to the earth so that we can navigate this change with grace. And also remember that we're all connected, and not get pulled into that other, like that sucking vacuum of divisiveness that's just being spread throughout our world, trying to make us think that we are separate, that we're so different from each other that we can't even sit at a dinner table with our family just because we might have a different political view. So, and then one more thing, do I have one more minute to share one more aspect?
Sure.
Okay, so one more thing, it's not just the animals, but the animals are grouped into one of 12 categories. So they're the guardians, they're the leapers, there are the messengers, the unifiers, there are the hunters and the warriors. So these are all archetypal life themes that we all deal with in our everyday life. And there are times when we need to unify, and there are times when we need to be warriors and to find out what's worth fighting for, right? And there are times when we need to be on a healing journey, and there are times when we need to go on a hunt, or accept that we're actually being hunted, and like trust that we're being hunted by the right person or the right environment or the right community. So there's this whole this whole unique journey that people go through as they move through these categories at their own pace, in their own order, that kind of make their lives just come alive, sort of hums in the background of the life, as Richard always says. And it just brings much more meaning and fun and adventure and support. So
that's a great description of the dream arc, and it is just the most amazing adventure. So switch the television off and go and have an adventure with the dream arc, because you don't know where you're going to end up. but you will learn something.
You will learn something. And there are even the laughers, which might tell you to watch a funny movie.
Yeah.
So that's a part of life too.
Yeah. So very quickly, I saw on your website that you have a free webinar, the Wisdom Keepers Collective Transformation. Is that still going?
Yeah, people can access that at any time that they want. That's true. And I bet it's still very relevant. It happened right around the start of COVID. It was kind of a very potent time in the world when I did that reading. I think it's sure, absolutely.
And very quickly, in less than a minute, your global outreach projects.
Oh my gosh. Okay, maybe I'll tie it in with the dream arc. So basically, Sandy, I'm working with a whole team, including my beloved sister, and a team of Ugandan educators, wisdom keepers, and cultural leaders on a universal love curriculum that is a collaboration, a genuine collaboration between the educators in Uganda and us, the Gene Keys and the Dream Arc, in creating a curriculum that does a lot of the things that I just talked about, basically. And it's going to be sourced in Africa. So we're going to also be integrating the animals of Africa, their own particular understandings of those animals, proverbs, and then creating a template that then ideally can be taken to other parts of the world where other indigenous elders, wisdom keepers, educators can then infuse the curriculum with the wisdom from and the natural wisdom, the animals from that part of the world. So I'm super excited about it. It's called the Universal Love Curriculum. We did a live stream about it called Generosity and the Great Change a little while ago, if anybody wants to check that out. And I'm just, I'm really excited about it.
Rosy Aronson,
yeah.
Thank you for adding your 10 best list of spiritual books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Sandy.
You're so welcome. For more information about Rosy Aronson's beautifully illustrated books, her magical art, online and self-study courses, global outreach projects, and of course, her globally loved Wisdom Keepers Oracle deck, visit wisdomkeepers.net, and you can find more information on the Dream Arc at thedreamarc.com. That's it for this week. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 Best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Rosy Aronson.